My great pleasure to introduce to the folks assembled here the keynote speaker for the evening, President of the American Radio Relay League, Craigie N3 Kilo November.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you very much to the Pacificon organizers for another opportunity to be at this wonderful convention in the Bay Area. When we were organizing and planning for the ARRL Centennial, we realized that realistically speaking, it would not be possible for everybody to come to Hartford in July and be part of the national convention there. I've talked to a number of people here who were there, and that's terrific, but we knew that it just wasn't going to be possible for every ham in the United States to be there. So we decided that it would be a good idea to designate a small number of the largest conventions around the country as regional centennial conventions, and of course Pacificon was on that list. And this is the final one of the regional centennial conventions, and we began with a wonderful experience in Orlando in February, and we end with a wonderful experience here in Santa Clara in October. So we appreciate the assistance of all the organizers of those conventions, and of course especially our friends here at Pacificon. So 100 years. I'm sure that the ARRL headquarters staff feels like in some ways that they've been there for the whole 100 years. They have really worked so hard. You know, people have their regular day jobs at ARRL headquarters. And on top of that, we asked them to organize and carry out the centennial activities and national convention, and they have done an amazing job. They really have. And the board of directors appreciates what the staff has done. And I hope that members across the country realize how hard these folks have worked. The volunteers like me, all we have to do is show up, hit our mark, and keep out of the way of the people who actually know what they're doing. It's the folks who work at ARRL headquarters who did the heavy lifting and made this centennial the fun that it is. Excuse me. So let's give them some recognition. 100 years ago, well, okay. One of the questions that I like to ask folks sometimes is, what do you think is the most important thing that the ARRL does? And I've gotten a bunch of answers that are plausible. Things like the publications. It's very important that people around the world buy ARRL publications, and not all of them are radio amateurs. They want the technical publications. So that's important. Fostering programs in public service is a very important part of what we do. The education program has been particularly dear to my heart, is a very important part of what we do to help the volunteer instructors around the country and to help classroom teachers make wireless communications a part of meat and potatoes education. It's not a frill, it's not fluff, this is real education for the world that our young people live in. So in fact, I even had one guy who, without a hint of humor whatsoever, informed me that, well, of course, the most important thing that the ARRL does is DXCC. And I didn't want to argue with him because, frankly, I was kind of scared to. I got into amateur radio to be a DXer, so, you know. But of the many important things that the ARRL does, the most important one from 1914 to 2014 has been advocacy. Okay, that's a $25 word, isn't it? It comes from the Latin root for voice. You advocate for something, you speak in favor of it, you speak out for it. So think of the ARRL over the last 100 years as a strong voice speaking out for amateur radio. And we have done it from that day to this. Even before the United States became involved in World War I, there was already a move on the part of the Navy to take control of all radio communications in the United States. It was safety of life at sea. The Titanic disaster certainly brought the importance of communications to the public's attention. So the Navy wanted to have control of all radio communications. Of course, there was no broadcasting in those days. Radio was very much in its infancy as an applied science. So even before World War I, the ARRL and its first president, Hiram Percy Maxim, W1AW, although he was only just 1AW in those days, had to lead the very small but very dedicated membership of the ARRL to lobby Congress not to let the Navy do that. Well, then the war broke out. We got involved in it in 1917. Amateur radio was off the air for the duration. The war ends. Did amateur radio come back on the air? Oh, no, it did not. It took a year and a half for amateur radio to get back on the air after the cessation of hostilities in November of 1918, because the Navy still wanted control of all radio communications in the United States. They didn't want those annoying radio amateurs with their huge, wide, spark gap signals that took up the full spectrum and then some. Safety of life at sea, it's hard to argue with that kind of thing, but Hiram Percy Maxim and Guglielmo Marconi and other folks did go to Washington. They mobilized the members of ARRL who were coming back from the war, who wanted to get back on the air and experiment with radio. They went to Washington, and finally, after a year and a half, they persuaded Congress that regular people, civilians, people like you and me, should be allowed to experiment with this new technology called radio. Now, stop and think for a minute, what if? I'm a science fiction fan. I like to think about what if, alternative realities, alternative timelines. What if the decision had been different? What if civilians had not been allowed to experiment with radio there in 1918 and 1919? What a different 20th century we would have lived in. If Hiram Percy Maxim and the ARRL had failed and amateur radio had not been allowed back on the air, I don't know what we'd be doing this evening, but we wouldn't be here talking about amateur radio. We'd be off somewhere else doing something else, and many of your careers wouldn't have existed at all. So that was a pivotal moment in the history of our country, and certainly in the history of amateur radio. Now, in the years since then, we have not had a comparable near-death experience for amateur radio, fortunately. But at the same time, the need for advocacy, for a strong voice speaking for amateur radio has been constant. The threats, the challenges may have differed over the years, but the need for that strong voice has always been there. So what does advocacy amount to for the ARRL over our first 100 years? Well, one of the things has to do with regulation. We have to have a progressive and rational regulatory environment for amateur radio to flourish and continue and make the contribution to technology and to the community's well-being. And most of the time, what the ARRL interacts with is the Federal Communications Commission. There are some other federal regulatory agencies that have to do with spectrum management, and we deal with them as necessary. But over the whole 100 years, from the days of the Federal Radio Commission on to the creation of the FCC and to the present day, the ARRL has done everything we believe that is necessary in order to promote a progressive regulatory environment that will allow us to operate and to experiment and to make the contribution to science and the community's well-being that we are capable of being. So regulation, the area of regulation, is a big part of our advocacy effort. And we did it then, and we do it now, and we will always do it. Another area of advocacy that we have been involved with is legislation. When Mr. Maxim went to Washington and lobbied Congress, That had to do with the legislative branch of our government. And over the years, we have had legislative successes. Some years ago, we managed to, through the good offices of Senator Barry Goldwater, who was also K7UGA, we were able to get legislation passed that made possible the volunteer examining system, so that the examinations in amateur radio could be shifted into the private sector. And one of the great success stories of privatization in this country has been shifting the amateur radio examinations into the private sector through the volunteer examiner coordinators. When this was introduced, a lot of people were nervous about it. They weren't so sure that it was going to work. They didn't know for sure whether radio amateurs could do it logistically and ethically, but we have. We have. It's been a great success story. I took exams at the FCC and I took exams with the VEC system, and I'll tell you what, it sure was nicer to walk into that room and see my fellow radio amateurs who really wanted me to pass. You know, rather than being glared at by some bureaucrat who didn't give a hoot. And as soon as I could, I became a volunteer examiner so that I could give a hand up the ladder to my fellow radio amateurs. So legislation has been a big part of what we've done. Right now we are involved in a heavy push in Washington, D.C., and I've got the blisters to prove it on my feet, to obtain the success of H.R. 4969, which would extend the principles of PRB1, of reasonable accommodation of antennas, from folks like me who live in areas where land use is regulated by municipal zoning to folks who live in areas where there is private land use regulation. This has been a problem for 30 years. We have been working on it for 30 years. We have never been closer than we are right now to making a breakthrough. I will not make you promises that I'm not sure we can keep, but I have good feelings. We're working a strategy under the guidance of some very influential and powerful people on Capitol Hill. And if for some reason that doesn't work out, we will be back in the next Congress, in both houses of Congress. We will do it again, and we won't stop. We can't stop. We cannot allow amateur radio to be choked to death by the alarming growth in deed restrictions. It's everywhere, even in the sticks where I live in southwestern Virginia. Every new development, when somebody puts up a housing development in what used to be a cow pasture, they all have homeowner associations, and they all have the cookie cutter language. So on my side of the county, I can have an antenna. Oh, I helped negotiate the ordinance, didn't I? But my young friend, who's a very brilliant engineer who lives on the other side of the county in a newer neighborhood, he can't have an antenna. Well, he does, but he can't. And it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense from a regulatory standpoint. So that's why the Amateur Radio Parity Act would put us all on the same regulatory footing so that we all have the opportunity not to do whatever we darn well please, but to come with our fellow citizens and negotiate something that makes sense from a technical standpoint, but also doesn't do horrible violence to the nature of the neighborhood that we live in. So we're working very hard on that. I've spent 2 full weeks in Washington. We have ARRL directors who have pounded the pavements through the halls of Congress. We have members of the ARRL, leaders of the ARRL who have met in the district with their members of Congress. And when the bill dropped in late June, as of the end of, when they recessed in October, we had gained 47 co-sponsors. But wait, as the guy says in the infomercial, there's more. By my count, right now we have 11 additional co-sponsors who will sign on to the bill once Congress comes back into session after the November elections. That's astounding to be able to accomplish that in a very short length of time. It is not partisan politics. We have people who are signed on to co-sponsor this bill who are so philosophically distant from one another that I don't think they give each other the time of day if they passed one another in the hall. But they've come to co-sponsor this legislation to help amateur radio. So we will continue with that legislation. If the strategy we're working on right now doesn't work, we've got a plan B and a plan C, but we won't stop. We can't. It's the survival of amateur radio. So legislation at the federal level is important, has been over the years. But there's also legislation that isn't federal. There's state legislation that has to do with amateur radio in one way or another. And there's also local legislation in the ordinances that get passed in our municipalities, some of which are kind of nutty. There was one back in my area years ago when I used to live in southeastern Pennsylvania where a town decided they were going to regulate space stations. I'm not a scientific expert, but I don't think Havertown Township, Pennsylvania, has jurisdiction over satellites in outer space. I just don't think so. So the fact that legislation from local ordinances to state laws still affects our lives as amateur radio. And the ARRL has programs that also address those. This is where our ARRL field organization comes in through our section managers and our state government liaisons and local government liaisons. So the ARRL has an organizational ability to address some of those legislative issues, advocacy, speaking out for amateur radio. We have programs with our volunteer council. We're radio amateurs who are attorneys, with volunteer consulting engineers who can help give testimony about what's a rational thing to have in an ordinance. So from the federal level on Capitol Hill to your local county or town zoning commissions, the ARRL has a role to play in support of legislative efforts to make sure that amateur radio can contribute, and can experiment and can help make our communities better and safer places to live. So legislation has been a big piece of what we do, advocacy for amateur radio. There's another piece. Every now and again, unfortunately, issues wind up in courts of law, whether it's a case that has to do with antenna privileges or something else that has to do with amateur radio. Sometimes things just end up in court because that's how civilized people settle their differences, isn't it? So that's where our volunteer council come into play. These are amateurs who are attorneys who agree to provide an initial consultation to a radio amateur free of charge. Then if they choose to go on and have a business relationship, that's their choice, and they work out the dollars and cents however they choose to. But the volunteer council play a very important role, and they have done in some very, very significant amateur radio related litigation that has established the body of case law that I can go into a congressional office and say, look, the case law for PRB1 is there. So this is not something new. This has been put through the courts, and by and large it has come out in support of antenna privileges and other kinds of issues like that. So if you are an attorney who's a radio amateur, if you know an attorney who's a radio amateur, they might want to find out about the volunteer council program to see if that's something that they would be interested in pursuing, so that they can help their fellow radio amateurs decide if they have an issue when the subject of litigation comes up. So that's something that happens at the local level. Every now and again, the ARRL has had to sue the FCC. We don't do this very often because, number one, it is hideously expensive. I mean, it is just brutally expensive, and you may or may not be able to prevail because the courts tend to assume that regulatory agencies know what they're doing. Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. If we thought they knew what they were doing, we wouldn't be suing them, would we? So some years ago, we sued them about the loss of part of the old 220 megahertz band. We lost that case. But we had to do it. When the issue of broadband over power lines came along, and the FCC was just making wrong decisions, just absolutely contrary to scientific fact. We had to pursue that in court. We knew that we might not win. We knew that it was going to cost an arm and a leg, but we also knew that we had to do it. I can't stand up here in front of a bunch of radio amateurs and say we are advocates for amateur radio if we don't have the backbone to file a lawsuit when something is just wrong. We just, I can't, looking at this face in the morning is hard enough. I can't do it if I know that I'm just really not being truthful with you people, So we filed that suit. We prevailed on a number of points, which was a very pleasant surprise. And in the end, a deficient technology kind of faded away between the lawsuit and the wisdom of the marketplace. That technology has pretty well dried up and blown away. But we had to do that. We spent an enormous amount of your money, the membership's money, but we felt that there was no alternative to doing that if we're going to say that we are advocates for amateur radio. So we lost a little bit of that battle, but we won the war. And broadband over power line is not a significant problem anymore to amateur radio. So litigation has been part of what we do. It's a big part of advocacy. Well, there's another part of advocacy that lots of times we don't really think about as being advocacy, and that is public relations. But when we do this, whether it's placing a story in national media, placing a story in your local media, that's advocacy. That's voices speaking out for amateur radio. And this is something that each and every one of us can do. Every time you tell a neighbor or a coworker or just somebody that you know. My husband has been known to buttonhole people on airplanes so they can't get away from him. Bless his heart. To talk about why amateur radio is good, why it's fun, why it makes a difference in people's lives, why it makes our communities better, safer places to live. Whenever you do that, you are an advocate for amateur radio. We can do it at the national level. The field organization has volunteers who do this at the section level. But each and every one of us is involved in advocacy for amateur radio when we share our delight in being radio amateurs with someone we know or someone who can't get away from us on an airplane. But it's very, very important because you just never know which one of those people is going to say, I might like to get involved in that. And they follow it up and they become a radio amateur. You don't know what they're going to turn out to contribute to amateur radio. So each and every one of us, as a person who finds delight and meaning in amateur radio, we can all be advocates for amateur radio. And I'm sure you can think about times when you've mentioned something about why amateur radio is important and good in your life. You were an advocate. You were part of that. So the ARRL does what we can do at the national level, and clubs do what they can do. And each of us as individuals has opportunities and a responsibility, I think, to make sure that we tell people and spread the good word about amateur radio. So we have many aspects of advocacy that the ARRL and ARRL members have been involved in over the last 100 years, and we will continue to do that for the next 100 years. But there's a side to this that sometimes we don't really think about. And when we file a lawsuit, when we prepare a filing on some regulatory issue or the other for the FCC or at the international level, they're not going to do it just because we're nice guys and just because we said so. We have to have the science. We have to have the evidence. And more than any other group of people who prepare that evidence, the science that underlies our argument, are the people at the ARRL lab. And I would say that even if Ed Hare were not in this room. And I have done before, as a matter of fact. Because these are the people who do the studies, the ARRL lab people and other ARRL volunteer experts who work with the lab, who prepare the scientific information, the proof, the studies, that make it possible for us to go to the FCC or go into court and say, it's not just because we said so. Here's the science that shows it. And we would never have had the success that we've had in 100 years if it were not for the people on staff in the ARRL lab and the volunteers who work with them. So please remember that. When you pay your ARRL dues, you're supporting that advocacy effort, whether it's the volunteers in the field, whether it's the expenses of those of us who are volunteers at the national level, the folks who work at ARRL headquarters who are strong advocates for amateur radio, not just because it's their job, but because they love it. So that's what your $39 is going for in a very, very real way. You're making a difference. You're helping us with that advocacy program. Well, yeah, that's what we do here in the States. Spectrum management doesn't begin at home. It begins at the international level. There's an organization that was also founded by Hiram Percy Maxim in the mid-1920s called the International Amateur Radio Union. By the 1920s, it was pretty clear to visionary people like Mr. Maxim that radio was pretty soon going to be spanning the oceans and spanning the world, and that regulation at the international level was something that was going to happen, and amateur radio had better be ready. And so he and some other people met in Paris, and they formed the International Amateur Radio Union. Today, that organization is made up of the world's amateur radio societies, like the ARRL here, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the Radio Society of Great Britain, all those national amateur radio societies. We cooperate together so that when there are spectrum management and regulatory conferences at the international level, that we have strong voices speaking for amateur radio in many languages at that level. And I had the privilege of attending one of those conferences several years ago, just as an observer. And you know, intellectually, I knew the importance of what goes on there, but to see the radio amateurs from many countries cooperating together, strategizing together to speak to the interests of amateur radio at the very highest regulatory levels, you know, it really brought it home for me, and I appreciated those people, most of whom are volunteers. They're IARU volunteers. And so the advocacy for amateur radio happens in our individual home countries, but it also happens in a very, very important way at the international level at those World Radio Communication Conferences. And there are meetings going on all the time that are preparing for the next WRC, which will be next year in 2015. So advocacy is something that the ARRL has done for 100 years, and if amateur radio lasts for 1,000 years, we will continue to do it. We will continue to cooperate with our fellow national societies around the world to achieve the best regulatory climate for amateur radio that is possible to achieve. And you as members of the ARRL make that possible. You make it possible by being members of the ARRL, by your support, by your activity through the field organization, through your clubs, through your nets, through your public service organizations. You are definitely a very important part of amateur radio advocacy. I like to say that especially in the area of this HR 4969, we couldn't be where we are if it had not been a whole membership effort. Individuals contacting their members of Congress, sitting down with their members of Congress, those of us who are able to go to Washington. It's taken all of us to make the kind of progress we have in the incredibly short length of time that we've had to do it. So all of us are part of the ARRL's advocacy, whether it's at the local level, the national level, or the international level. So thank you for what you do to be voices speaking for amateur radio. And please know that your ARRL will always be there to assist and insofar as we can to lead that effort. So as we begin the second century of amateur radio and the ARRL, let's continue to work together as strong voices speaking for amateur radio. Thank you.